Right, we are in lesson 6. So this is more about creating a safe environment to heal for clients. There is a specific reading assignment here which a component of the lecture will go over. So you're really going to need to watch all of this. And then the discussion board topics for this lesson are: describe details of a clinical environment that is trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive. Topic 2, talk about how traditional clinical approaches differ from a trauma-centered approach. And by the way, the answers to these are in large measure in the website reading assignment, okay? So we're going to get going right away. So although typically people suggest that you not read from the slides, I'm going to read in this case. Here again, defined by SAMHSA, a program, organization, or system that is trauma-informed realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery. It recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the system, and responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into its policies, its procedures and practices, and it seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. We're going to go over the 4 R's here. You're going to see a little repetition of some principles that you've seen in a prior lesson as well. So again, here's a good definition from SAMHSA on how you build a strong trauma-informed practice. Okay, so repetition, the 6 key principles. This will also be in the website here that I go over with you here in just a minute as well. You've seen this already in a prior lesson: the safety, trustworthiness and transparency, the peer support, the collaboration and mutuality, the empowerment, voice and choice, and the cultural, historical, and gender issues. Again, all something that we've gone over in a previous lesson. Okay, so begins the tour of one of our reading assignments for this lesson. SAMHSA's Concept of Trauma, Guidance for a Trauma-Informed Approach. I need you to look at this. This is the assigned reading for this lesson. I'm going to pay particular attention to page 9. I'm going to scroll through here kind of quickly. You need to kind of read some of the things beforehand. I will tell you, around page 9 are a couple of hints for the quiz coming up at the end of this lesson. So when I get here to the top of page 9, trauma-informed approach, key assumptions and principles. One thing I'm going to backtrack. This is where we're going to focus on, but let me back up just a hair. Here's what we've really already talked in some extensive detail about: the 3 E's of trauma: events, experience of events, and effect. So give a quick read through some of these things. We've discussed this already in some detail. Here are your trauma-informed approaches, key assumptions, and principles. So, new concept for this lesson: the 4 R's, key assumptions in a trauma-informed approach. Realization, right here. Recognize, responds, and lastly, resists re-traumatization. So these are environmental things. So again, we're in this middle section of the lesson where we're talking about how an organization can support people that have experienced trauma. In fact, as I look back up here, a trauma-informed approach is distinct from a trauma services or trauma systems. A trauma-informed approach is inclusive of trauma-specific interventions, assessment, treatment, recovery. It incorporates key trauma principles into the organizational culture. So when you look about realization, this is an organizational concept. The organization realizes about trauma, how trauma affects families, groups, organizations, communities, etc. It then builds an environment that is conducive to treating trauma. It recognizes the signs of trauma. The organization recognizes the signs of trauma. These can be based on gender, age, setting specific, etc. We've talked about communities and cultures and things like that. It looks at things like trauma screening and assessment, supervision practices it mentions there. And then the organization responds by applying principles of a trauma-informed approach to all areas of functioning. And go ahead and read the rest of that. And then it resists re-traumatization. So here's the deal. Re-traumatization, really problematic. So earlier in earlier lessons we talked about some specific clinical approaches. If you remember right, I mentioned about prolonged exposure. Okay, I do not use a lot of prolonged exposure in the environment in which I work in the Department of Corrections. It's very difficult to want to expose a client in that setting to a severe traumatic or multiple traumatic events and then release them back into an environment that is really unsafe, not nearly as supportive emotionally as it should be, and that's really problematic. So in this particular case, I'm making a clinical decision in an effort to not re-traumatize my clients in that particular setting. If you can be in a setting where you can create an environment that is unlikely to re-traumatize, leave the client in a vulnerable position once you're done with the therapeutic approach, whatever the therapeutic approach may be. I'll mention another approach. So we talked about EMDR earlier as well in the other lesson. EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. What you do at the end of a session is here. This is how I would characterize it. When you're dealing with your client, you've gone through an EMDR session. You help the client repackage the traumatic event that you're dealing with, and by repackage it is you're having them basically put it away, and you're building within. You've also built within the client prior to this the skill set to be able to put that traumatic event away so that they don't have to be re-traumatized by it later on. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? So these are techniques. Again, in this particular sense, we're talking about the 4 R's. In this case, the organization is going to help hopefully create an environment where, again, you can see they inadvertently create stressful or toxic environments and interfere with the recovery of clients. Okay, resisting re-traumatization. Now notice what's here. These should be familiar to you if you're paying attention to the earlier lesson. 6 key principles of a trauma-informed approach. Here they are again. Okay, so there they are. So here's what I want you to look at in this particular reading assignment. There are 27 pages here. I highly recommend you really go through all of them and reevaluate. Okay, thanks. Once you're done, then here are the 4 R's again. So again, realization, recognize, respond, and resist trauma, re-traumatization. All right. So far we've covered quite a bit in this lesson. I hope you've enjoyed the website information. Now we're at the end of lesson 6. We're going to go over the discussion topics here in just a minute. Remember, there's a quiz here at the end. You're going to need to have paid attention to lessons 4, 5, and this one, number 6. Read through the material, gone through those websites, because the quiz will cover the material that's found in those, okay? So let's go over those discussion topics. All right, so the discussion boards for this lesson, topic 1, describe details of a clinical environment that is trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive. Again, you're going to build into those things what we went through in that website. Topic number 2, talk about how traditional clinical approaches differ from a trauma-centered approach. And again, you get that from the reading as well. Okay. Anyway, I look forward to reading your discussion board topics. I look forward to answering them and responding back and forth, maybe having some dialogue about those. And I'm sure you guys will do just great on the quiz. Thanks.